All right, so welcome everyone. I'm going to go over the guidelines for the meeting today, although most of us are familiar with this all by now. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Please do not unmute and mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on participants and unmute their microphone. If you're on a phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rasheen Foley via the chat box or by rfoley@ctbs.org or 857-702-3704. Next, I'll read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctbs.org or 857-702-3704. All right, first item on the agenda is introductions. Jonathan, you want to go ahead and read the roll?
Okay, will do, Mr. Chair. MassDOT Chair.
Steve Wolfel, representing Acting Secretary and CEO of MassDOT, Jamie Tesler.
MassDOT C2.
Not seeing John at the moment.
Okay.
MassDOT. Just so you guys know, John emailed David. He'll be half an hour late today, but he'll be eventually in the meeting.
Okay. MassDOT Highway Division. Okay. MBTA.
Jillian Linnell, representing General Manager POFTAC.
Thank you. Massachusetts Port Authority. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, present. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Good morning. After the session of town meeting, Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here.
Thank you. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
Tom Kazis, City of Boston, representing Mayor Kim Janey.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Janey in the City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
Thank you. At-large City of Newton.
David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
At-large Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy and MPO area towns.
Okay, thank you. At-large Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Austin Sagano with the Town of Acton, representing the Magic Subregion.
Thank you. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keyser, representing Mayor Spicer for Metro West.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly. Okay. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, Town of Rockland, representing the South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. And I need to take a step back. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning. Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone and the Anacor.
Thank you. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Town of Medway, Peter Pelletier.
Thank you. And Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. Our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
Thank you. And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Again, welcome to everyone. On the Chair's report, I just want to let folks know and remind everyone the Innovation Conference will be held late in May. Registration's open, so please check out the University of Massachusetts Transportation Center website to go ahead and register. And we have started putting up the program, so please take a look. I want to take the rest of my Chair's report time to turn it over to David, who will go over the recent work that we've been doing, MassBut's been doing with our congressional delegation on earmark. So could someone unmute David so we can give an update on that?
They already unmuted me, Steve.
All right, good.
Good job, Matt. So there are two earmark processes that were going on in the last month, maybe. The first was for the annual appropriations bill. These are congressional earmarks. And the second one was for the reauthorization of the transportation bill for the House. So for appropriation earmarks, there's no involvement of the MPO or MassDOT necessarily. They are just earmarked by Congress and they appear in the appropriations bill. For the Transportation Reauthorization Act, this is the first time in over a decade that the House has allowed earmarks, which they're no longer calling earmarks, they're calling member designated projects. And so the Transportation Infrastructure Committee put out a set of rules and guidelines concerning what could be earmarked and how it has to be earmarked. And so each member was given, I believe, $20 million to earmark, up to $20 million. No limit on the number of projects, but $20 million limit. And each project had to be have a letter from the sponsoring agency that it could be implemented, have a discussion of where the funding was going to come from if it was not fully funded by the earmark. And also, if it's not on the STIP, then you need a letter from the MPO saying it can get on the STIP in a reasonable time frame. So the timing of this was such that we could not bring these discussions to the MPO. So MassDOT, as chair, wrote letters on the MPO's behalf, this MPO and all the other MPOs in the state, about whether earmarked projects could make it onto the TIP in a reasonable period of time. We did that by basically being guided by two issues. The first was, is the project fully funded by non-MPO resources? And consistent with the guidelines in the member designated projects, they are supposed to be. They are required, each sponsoring agency is required to let the member know where the money will come from that is not provided in the earmark. Typically, they have pledged MassDOT revenue and local revenue. The ones I've seen, I've only seen a couple. So we wrote a letter, and the second issue was, could it be amended onto the STIP in a reasonable period of time? And we interpreted that to be readiness, and could we make a project ready in time for amending onto the upcoming STIP? So basically, could be ready in the next 5 years. Now, most of these projects are not currently on the STIP. If they're on the STIP, they don't need a letter. Most of them are not actually even in our project development system. So we had to do this readiness and assessment based on very limited information provided by the sponsors. When in doubt, we erred on the side of recommending approval. And so we sent out a bunch of letters on behalf of this MPO saying that we believed projects could get in the STIP in a reasonable period of time. And now I think I'll take questions.
All right, anyone have any questions for David? Matt, are you seeing any questions? I don't see any hands raised.
Seeing none.
Oh, Eric did. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric.
Hey, sorry, David. You probably were hoping no one was going to ask questions.
No worries.
Is this process done now, or because we've also received we've been getting some requests from municipalities about submitting things to Congress people and questions about this. Is the timeline for this complete now, or is it ongoing? I'm just curious about that.
So this process closed Tuesday at midnight.
Okay.
So yes, this process is done. Now, this process was only in the House. The Senate has not yet agreed that they will do earmarks. Okay. So as of today, this process is closed. Now, this process closed midnight Tuesday. I think that was the second extension of the process. So, as of today, the process is closed. And I believe certainly the lists that have been filed probably add up to the 20 million for each member.
And David, I would just add, we're getting the letter. Brian's working with his team to get the letters out, all the letters to each of the MPOs that we sent out.
Yeah, they went out this morning to the staff. MPO staff can send them out to the members if the members so desire.
And so just to understand, the earmark either needed to fully fund the project. So, it needed to either be, small or one project for 20 million or something like that. And you all had to assess whether that was accurate. And then secondly, whether the project was such that it could then be amended onto the tip. It wasn't something so complex that needed extensive environmental permitting or something like that really would not be realistic to be able to get ready in the next 5 years.
Yes. So on the first issue, funding, the project sponsor, which MassDOT did not sponsor any of these projects. Okay, we did not ask for any earmarks. The project sponsor, which was typically a local government, was required to document for the member where the non-federal share was coming from. So if the earmark is 80% of the project's cost, then consistent with our standing practices and procedures, people can assume that MassDOT will provide the match.
Right.
We match on an 80-20 basis. If the project was less than that, people cannot and should not assume that. And I only saw a couple of actual applications. Generally, I just saw a list. But most of the applications I saw pledged local revenue to make up the difference. We didn't make any assessment of whether that was true, okay? The letter, when you see the letter, what the letter basically says is, given that the process requires these earmarks to be fully funded, and that the letter doesn't say this part, but none of them pledged MPO revenue, okay? I would not personally have been comfortable, nor would Mass have been comfortable giving you a letter out that says this could be on the STIP and pledging future target money, right? That was not something we could do. So the project, by definition, is fully funded with the earmark and some other source of revenue that is not MPO funded. Therefore, I could send out a letter saying, based on the fact that it's fully funded and that we think it can be ready, we believe it can get amended into the STIP.
Okay. I guess my question was more about if a community said we want to build this section of trail or something like that, and we think that's going to cost like $5 million. Did you all do any assessment of whether you thought that was actually like a $5 million project, or were you just sort of saying like, yeah, that, that's within the realm of possibilities where,
Right. So none, like, as I said, I think most of these projects are not in our project development system yet.
So you can't even do that.
We've done no independent assessment of their cost estimates. We've done only a very back of the envelope assessment of whether they could be ready. Okay. So, we don't necessarily know whether most of them will require permits or right of way. Some of them we know. We don't know how extensive it is. We had to make our best guess. And as I said, we erred on the side of, given the fact that we have 4 or 5 years to get it ready, most projects can be made ready. So we erred on the side of telling a member we would recommend that it could be put in the STIP.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, other hands raised. Any more questions for David?
Yep, got Tom O'Rourke.
Tom, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just a quick question, Dave. Did you have any idea how many projects were being applied for?
So I think, so two things. First off, if a project is in the STIP, it didn't need a letter from the MPO because it's already in the STIP. The number of letters that I actually ended up writing, I think is probably close to 30 or 40. I didn't actually take a count. There were, throughout the process, members had other, members had projects that were on the list, and then they took them off the list for whatever reason, and then they added a new project. So I don't know how many projects were actually under consideration, but the number of projects I wrote a letter for, I think, are probably about 30. But again, I didn't actually take account. It seemed at the time, Tom, that it was 100, but I'm sure that's not true.
I'm sure. All right, thank you.
All right, Matt, who's up next?
Steve Olenoff.
Steve, go ahead.
Steve Olenoff, Trick Subregion. So I'm old enough to remember when we actually had these things, and the questions that were always asked were, where's this money coming from? Is this really additional money, or is it money that's ultimately coming out of our target money?
Right, and it has been purported to us that this is additional money above and beyond the what would normally be provided in a formula fund. Okay, I believe that is true. In any case, even if it's not, we'll never know because Congress will tell us it was true. But I believe it's true.
All right, Matt, anyone else?
Tom Kadzis.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And thanks, David, for doing that on behalf of the MPO with the short notice. I got a little confused. Who is the letter going to, David?
So the letter I wrote went to each individual member. So there.
Okay.
And to back up, there's actually two letters. So MassDOT as the project sponsor, and I use that term in terms of implementing agency, not we recommended the projects. The implementing agency was required to send a letter saying we are committed to implementing this project if it gets an earmark. Secretary sent a single letter to each member with just a list of projects that you asked about these projects, we'll implement them if they get earmarked. I, on behalf of the MPO, sent an individual letter for each project to each member. So the member got the letter, and then the member either filed it, or if the member was having the local government filed, he or she would provide the letter to the local government. But the letter went to the member.
Thanks a lot. And is there a list of the projects or a link to the projects? I'm just thinking of questions that people will ask me, just thinking ahead. In the letter, is there?
So there is no link that I know. Well, so the members, each individual member is required as part of this process to put on their website the projects that they recommended, and I think prioritize the top 5. I don't know if they're required to also list the ones that they didn't recommend. I don't think they are, but their actual list of recommendations will appear on their website. We have all of the letters, and the MPO has them all. So I would request that Matt or Jonathan or whoever's going to take care of it, just send it out to all the members, and then you will each know within your subregions or your own individual communities whether a letter was issued on your behalf.
Well, thanks a lot, David, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep, no problem, Tom. Matt, anyone else?
Ken Miller.
Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things. One, I do want to point out that, as David mentioned, this is not an actual bill yet. So I guess we'll all see what happens when the House and the Senate get together and actually pass through authorization. The other thing I would say is, I'm not going to. We don't, as a federal entity, we are not going to lobby Congress or even say anything about the bill. But I should point out that just because these funds are whether they're earmarked or the MPO is not required to actually program the project just because there is an earmark. Now, having said that, it is funds that probably most likely cannot be used for anything else. And so you have to consider that, but there is no requirement that the MPO actually program any projects. Once it becomes available.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Anyone else, Matt?
Jim Fitzgerald.
Jim, go ahead.
Just a quick question, which kind of what Ken said leads me to this as well. So did I hear it right that any of these that might get approved, do they only have to be on the STIP or do they also have to be on our TIP?
Well, so they have to be on, technically they have to be on the STIP, but in order to get on the STIP in the Boston region, they have to be on the TIP.
Gotcha. I should have known that. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
Seeing none.
All right. Thank you, David.
Thanks, guys.
All right, Matt, let's move to the next agenda item 3, the Executive Director's Report. Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a few items, so please do bear with me. I wanted to give you a few updates on CTPS, the staff to the MPO, and what is going on with us. First of all, I wanted to bring back up our 5-year strategic plan, which you've heard about in the past. I wanted to mention that we've had the final meeting with our Strategic Plan Steering Committee, which is a group of staff and some members of this board. So we're in the process now of taking the last of the feedback and talking with the chair and the vice chair of this board and hoping to finish up what will be a pretty solid draft final within the next few weeks. So we hope to come back to you pretty soon with a summary of what we've put together. In addition, I wanted to mention, we have a few ongoing recruitments, but I wanted to mention one in particular, and that's that on Monday, our new Director of Projects and Partnerships will be starting with CTPS on Monday, May 3rd. This will be, her name is Rebecca Morgan, and this position is largely replacing the Director of Technical Services position, which we had and was filled by Scott Peterson, who left CTPS earlier this year. The reason why it has a different name is that it's been reframed a bit to emphasize a focus on and to sort of draw in the skill set of a director that will really work on enhancing our partnerships with those that we work with on projects and how we can really achieve best practices in carrying out and delivering projects. So Rebecca Morgan comes to us with 13 years of experience in transportation consulting and also in leadership. She has pretty extensive experience in project people and relationship management, and I think that will make her a really excellent addition to our team. I did have the pleasure of working with her a number of years ago in the private sector, and so I knew about her work and how successful she was there, but she's recently turned her passion towards engaging in meaningful work in the public sector. So we are very thrilled to have her, and I'm sure you will enjoy meeting her in the coming weeks. So then I wanted to move on to our usual outreach updates. I wanted to highlight kind of 3 main things. One is that tomorrow at 3 p.m., we're hosting an event with our in-house expert cartographer, Ken Dumas. And this event is called The History of the MBTA Spider Map. Ken has been the map designer for the MBTA for over 30 years. And both his knowledge of the evolution of the maps, but also the way he tells the story of that history is absolutely fascinating and completely compelling. So I hope that some of you can join. The registration link is, and any other details on the event are available on the MPO calendar. So please do check that out. Again, it's tomorrow at 3. In addition, in May, we have 2 upcoming virtual TIP open houses that we'll host. Those will be on May 10th and May 19th. And those details will be are posted now on the MPO calendar. And then I also wanted to mention that and the final one is that we are sort of carrying out our next steps in the meetings related to the Pilot Transit Working Group. And those meetings are going to be a series of informal conversations or something we're calling coffee chats. And they'll be focused on a variety of topics. They're intended to be very small groups, so the attendance will be capped. And they'll be focused on working group members. And it'll be taking place over the next few weeks. And the idea is that this will create a different kind of environment for conversation and sharing experiences and ideas between the transit working group members. So we'll have about an hour long for each of the following topics. The topics will be microtransit, medical and human service transportation, partnerships for ongoing transit recovery, and improving connections and closing gaps. If you have any questions about that, want to understand the events better, please reach out to Michelle Scott, who is facilitating these and running this program. And her email is mscott, MSCOTT, @ctps.org. Okay, with that, I just want to turn our attention to today, set a little bit of ground setting. So just another couple of minutes. So first of all, we'll have 2 work scopes for your review. These are the scopes that you approve. If you approve, they will kick off our project work. That will be on an intersection improvement program and a bus network redesign equity analysis. And then there will be 5 substantive items on the agenda. So we will have a heavy agenda today. We have 2 amendments for the FY federal fiscal year 21 to 25 TIP. And if you vote to approve them for the 21-day public comment period, you will vote to endorse after that 21-day public comment period. MBTA staff is also going to present the MBTA projects anticipated to be in the FY federal fiscal year 22 to 26 TIP. MPO staff will also talk about a really interesting study that's been posted about incorporating resilience considerations into our MPO funded corridor and intersection studies. And some of that work is based on a case study, but it really is, I would say, an impressive body of work about thinking about how to better incorporate resiliency into the work that we do as staff to the MPO in general. Seth Asante will provide you with a short summary, but I recommend you take a look at the report. And then finally, there's a topic that we're coming back to you with, which I think is very relevant, interesting, and important. It really ties into our long-range planning effort, which is certainly a long-range effort, but this is a really timely moment to talk about our modeling work again. So Marty Milkovits is back to talk about our model roadmap, which is a strategic direction for our modeling tools. And he'll also talk as part of that about the fundamentals which drive the direction that we're taking our tools in. This may seem like it's less technical, but the point is that it is important always to ground our technical work in the foundations and sort of the fundamental questions of why we do what we do and when. And that includes with modeling. We should always be asking ourselves the question, sort of why and when we are doing that work. And then he'll expand on that in our prior discussion to talk about how we're going to modify our tools to better support your decision-making based on the principles of making our tools more accessible and transparent, being able to communicate our tools better, particularly the strengths, the usability, the values, and the limitations. And then through all of that, empowering you all and others in the region as the stakeholders that are using these tools or that these tools are supporting to better understand how and why they can help you engage in planning processes and make decisions. So a timeline is driven by the fact that we want to develop these tools so we can do scenario planning for the 2020 LRTP. It sounds far away, but if we're going to do meaningful scenario planning, we have to start as soon as we can. And it'll also allow us to get towards incorporating better equity-related metrics. So all very important stuff today. Thank you for bearing with me on the summary. I want to emphasize also the next meeting is 1 week away on May 6th, and the primary agenda item will be the release of the federal fiscal year 22 to 26 for public comment. So that's why we're meeting two meetings in a row. It has to do with that timing for releasing that for public comment. And we'll also have a few other topics on that agenda as well. And that is all, Mr. Chair.
All right, any questions for Tegan?
Ken Miller.
Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to put in a pitch for folks to participate in the Ken Dumas's presentation tomorrow. We had Ken over a while ago in our office to do this presentation, and it was interesting and quite entertaining. So I'm just encourage folks to attend tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Any questions for Tegan?
Seeing none.
All right, thank you, Tegan. Let's move on to agenda item 4, public comments. Are there any members of the public that would like to address the MPO today?
Seeing none.
All right, let's move to agenda item 5, which is committee chairs reports. Are there any committee chairs that have reports today?
It would not appear so.
All right, so we'll now move to agenda item 6, Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had a meeting since our last MPO meeting, and we went over the universe of the for the UPWP, and all I can say is this was my third time discussing it, and I'm happy I had so many opportunities to discuss it. The group was really good. We've done a meeting the previous day with the 3C committee, and the group is very enthusiastic about reviewing the studies, and I commend the group for their diligence in going through the studies and making decisions about what to recommend. So that's about it. Thank you.
Any questions for Leonard? Seeing none, thanks, Leonard. All right, we'll move to agenda item 7, which is an action item. It's a consideration of endorsement of Amendment 4 to the 2021 to 2025 TIP. Matt?
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm here with you all today to discuss 2 proposed amendments to the fiscal years 21 through 25 Transportation Improvement Program. We'll begin today with Amendment 4, which makes one change to the federal fiscal year 2021 highway programming. This change is detailed on a handout that is available on the MPO's meeting calendar for your review. To summarize, Amendment 4 proposes the addition of project number 608836, drainage improvements on Route 9 at the Route 126 interchange in Framingham. This project is proposed for just under $2.1 million in funding, using available MassDOT prioritized highway funds in fiscal 2021. These funds are newly available as a result of a decrease in cost for another stormwater improvement project along Interstate 95 in Attleboro. The amendment is needed to allow this project to move forward with a May 2021 advertisement date. Amendment 4 was released for a 21-day public review period after a vote by this board at the MPO meeting on March 25th. That review period ran from April 1st through April 21st, and no public comments were submitted during that time. That's all I have on Amendment 4, so I'll turn it back over to the chair for questions and a final vote on the amendment.
All right, can I get a motion and a second to approve Amendment 4, please? And please remember to state your name and your affiliation. That'll open up to any questions anyone has for Matt.
Thatcher Keyser.
Yes, Thatcher Keyser, City of Framingham. I make the motion to move this matter.
And Eric.
Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I second that motion.
All right, any questions for Matt? All right, I don't see any. So Jonathan, do you want to read the roll?
Sure. Steve Wolfel,
Yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane votes yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Laughing at Kane's backdrop, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes, Kansas.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt. I'm assuming Matt didn't go anywhere because he's up next. We have agenda item 8 is another action item. It's Amendment 5 for Federal Fiscal Year 2021 to 2025 TIP. This is for consideration of endorsement. Go ahead, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Still here. Moving now to Amendment 5 to the Federal Fiscal Years 21 through 25 Transportation Improvement Program. Like Amendment 4, The full details of Amendment 5 are available in a table posted to the MPO meeting calendar for your review. Amendment 5 addresses the cost and schedule changes for projects funded using regional target funds in federal fiscal year 2021, allowing these projects to move forward with advertisement for construction bids before the current federal fiscal year ends. Because the changes in fiscal 2021 impact the following 5 years, Amendment 5 makes further cost, schedule, and project description changes to align the active federal fiscal years 21 through 25 TIP with the draft federal fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP, ensuring every year of the current TIP stays within its allotted funding limits. This means that fiscal years 2022 through 2025 are identical in both Amendment 5 and in the forthcoming 22 through 26 TIP, which will come before this board at next week's MPO meeting for a vote to release for public review. This also means that Amendment 5 reflects the funding decisions made on new projects by this board at the April 1st MPO meeting. As a reminder, this board elected to allocate $14.8 million in funding in federal fiscal year 2021 to phase 2 of the Columbus Avenue bus lane project in Boston. Amendment 5 also includes the roughly $2.5 million allocated to 9 new community connections projects selected for funding in fiscal years 2022 through 24. Outside of those 10 projects, Amendment 5 only contains changes to currently programmed projects. After the vote taken by this board on April 1st, Amendment 5 was released for a 21-day public review period. The comment period began on April 6th and extended until April 27th. During this time, 2 public comments were submitted, both in support of the continued funding of Phase 2D of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in federal fiscal year 2022. These comments come from Tom Michelman and Emily Teller, both from the Friends of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. The full text of these comments is available on the MPO website for your review. Collectively, the comments highlight the continued enthusiasm for the project among its many supporters and tout the transportation and recreation benefits the project will bring to the region. Mr. Michelman's letter notes the Friends' desire to support the project in staying on track for a 2022 advertisement and previews the forthcoming comment letters from the project's advocates that will likely be submitted during the formal comment period for the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP when it's released next week. Again, a vote today endorses Amendment 5 to the 21 through 25 TIP, and much of the same information will also be reflected in the 22 through 26 TIP. That new draft TIP, again, will come before this board for a discussion and a vote at next week's meeting, and the draft TIP will be posted to the MPO's website later today for your review. That's all I have on Amendment 5, so I'll turn it back over to the chair for questions and a final vote.
All right, can I get a motion second for Amendment 5, and then I'll open up any questions that anyone might have for Matt.
Leonard Diggins.
I make a motion to accept Amendment 5.
Eric.
Eric Barassa with MAPC. I second that motion.
All right, any questions for Matt?
Ken Miller.
Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question about how the community connections funding is showing in fiscal year 22. I just want to make sure I understand. So for the Newton Micro Transit Service and the Canton Royal Street Shuttle, you're saying it shows that 727,000 is programmed in 22. Is the total amount programmed in the 1 year, or is it actually programmed over the 3 years of the? I mean, I'm not sure I understand because it seems to show that all the funding in 1 year, but the notes say it's programmed over 3 years.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I just included each project once and then, tried to clarify in the notes, like how the funding was broken out. So it shows each project sort of in its first year of the new TIP, but the funding is indeed split out over 3 years for both of those microtransit projects.
Okay, great, because we will only be obligating 1 year at a time for those projects. There's no guarantee that once a project starts that it will qualify for the second or third year. So just want to make sure people understand. Thank you.
All right, any other questions?
Seeing none.
All right, Jonathan, do you want to read the roll, please?
Sure. Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane votes yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Gadsden, yes, thank you.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Neil Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowicz, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Matt. We will now move on to agenda item 9, which is another action item. It's a work scope on the intersection improvement program. Casey.
Good morning, everyone. All right, so I'm presenting the Intersection Improvement Program. The Intersection Improvement Program is the newest iteration of the work that the Boston Region MPO participated in with the Mass DOT's Highway Division in 2014. This is a 3C funded project. It has a $75,000 budget and a 6-month timeline. The objectives of this study are to identify as many locations for study as the budget allows and to provide low-cost, high-benefit improvement recommendations for the selected locations. The project work is divided into 6 unique tasks. The first is the inventory and selection of candidate locations, the process through which we will not only identify our federal fiscal year 2021 study locations, but also compile a list that will serve as a database of intersection locations with study potential for future projects. The second task is collecting and gathering data, which will be followed by our third task of evaluating the selected locations. The fourth task will be to develop improvement recommendations, and through our fifth task, we will document our findings and recommendations. Finally, our sixth task will be to finalize the study and prepare our presentation of the work for the MPO board. And that's it.
All right, does anyone have any, actually, can I get a motion and a second to approve the work scope? And then I'll open any questions that anyone has of Casey.
Eric Barassa,
Go ahead, Eric.
This is Eric Barassa. I make a motion to approve the Intersection Improvement Program work scope.
and Brian Kane.
Second.
All right, any questions for Casey?
Seeing Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There were a couple of intersections that were looked at in, I guess, in the 2014 version of this project from the MPO, and there was a consulting firm that was used in order to do those analyses and low-cost improvements. So is this, I'm curious if this project has a similar budget to that, and is all of this work going to be done in-house through MPO staff?
So this time the work is all going to be done in-house by MPO staff. So this is a slightly different version of the project. As you mentioned, in 2014, it was done by a private firm. So we won't be able to actually provide the improvements. I think the private consultant, from my understanding, did do some signal retiming, and that was included within their scope of work, which wouldn't be included within ours.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I don't think they did it for us, but that was that's a whole other issue. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from what they did and improve on what we can do for the future for everyone. So if you have suggestions from your experience, do let me know directly.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions?
And Diggins.
Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of learning from that 2014 study, so do we have a sense of how much follow-up was done with the recommendations from that 2014 study?
That is a good question. So I actually didn't work on that study. I started with the MPO in 2015. My understanding is that we, as the MPO, looked throughout the region and recommended 35 different intersections for the private firm to follow up on and provide recommendations for. And I'm not entirely sure what happened with each of those. I think that each intersection improvement that they provided, that they did follow through on, cost around $15,000. So I think it was pretty extensive. I just don't know how many they actually were able to do.
Thank you. And so that kind of led to my second question, and that is, what is it that we consider low cost? Like, what would be the upper bounds of low cost?
No, that's a good point. So for us, we're looking at things like signal retiming, restriping, really basic kind of quick short-term improvements that can have a high impact, a high benefit. So it wouldn't be anything that would cost major reconstruction. Yeah, so it wouldn't be anything that would. I'm not entirely sure what they spent their $15,000 on. If someone else has worked on that project and has more information, please do let me know.
Yeah, but I appreciate that. But what is our general sense of what is the upper bounds of low cost? Is it 20K, 50K?
I think that might be context specific.
Okay, gotcha. That's fine.
Yeah, which
fine.
I do understand that it would be helpful to have an actual number. We haven't put a number on it yet, but maybe as we get into the study, we'll provide some sort of boundary that we'll keep our recommendations within.
That's fine. Context specific is good enough for me, so
Okay.
I get that,
Okay.
and I respect that. So that's cool. And so lastly, are we? I know that we are going to a certain extent work with municipalities. We are going to work to kind of get buy-in from them, right? Because all right, and that would be great because
Absolutely.
this is going to be important work and be kind of a waste to do it and then not have them follow through. And I understand that municipalities have the limitations of what they can do, but maybe while also trying to be more equitable in the way that we spread the wealth, for lack of a better phrase. If we can also do what we can to help them be able to follow through, that would be great, even if it means coming back to the MPO to support in some way. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hard work.
Absolutely. And I really value those comments. I think that that's exactly what we, especially in our work, we want to make sure that we are choosing to provide recommendations where they can actually be implemented or where there's interest in implementing them. And then, and I think that that's really valuable, making sure that we can follow through and help these improvements along.
Casey, it looks like Mark has his hand up because he worked.
Yes, he did.
Mark, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, Len, just saying, when we're talking about low cost, we're talking about low cost for municipalities, what they can do with their typical maintenance budget. We're looking at probably signing, striping, maybe some curb work to do for pedestrian improvements and signal timing changes that we'll analyze. And during the last 2014 study, there was a consultant hired on to do some of the improvements that they recommended, mostly implementing the traffic signal retimings that they came up with during that project.
Thanks.
Does that help, Leonard?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Reed. And of course, my usual question is when they implemented it, do we know that it actually worked? But we'll work on figuring out those follow-ups. I know that follow-up studies are in the works or in progress. So thank you. I'm all set.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. I don't see any, Matt. So
seeing none.
Jonathan, you want to read the roll, please?
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell, okay, I will come back. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitz, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Austin Siganowitz, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Casey. So we will move on to the next action item, which is agenda item 10, I believe. It's an work scope on the bus network redesign equity analysis. Steve.
Hello, my name is Stephen Andrews. Today I'm presenting the work scope for the bus network redesign service equity analysis. This work is funded through the 3C program as well. We expect the work to take 5 months and cost just above $48,000. Over the past several years, MassDOT and the MBTA have been exploring how the MBTA functions as an interconnected system and how it serves its riders and potential riders through a project known as the bus network redesign. We expect new routes or new route alignments, at least, to come from the exercise, and we certainly expect the recommendations, if implemented, to trigger a Title VI service equity analysis, an FTA requirement to prevent discrimination to certain protected groups. CTPS will measure the impacts in terms of revenue vehicle hours and route length, which are 2 metrics specified in the MBTA's disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy. And MassDOT would also like us to measure the equity implications of 2 new metrics they've developed. And these are trip coverage and regional access. And in short, these metrics represent the quality of the MBTA network compared to competitive options such as the auto modes. We expect to complete the work in 3 large steps. The first one will be to reconfigure our existing tools to accept MassDOT's file formats and to incorporate their new metrics. Our second step will be to use those tools to evaluate a series of alternatives. And then following a period of public input, we will evaluate a preferred alternative. Last, we will provide map support, possibly by the pre-referenced Ken Dumas, and other technical support to the bus network redesign process. Thank you, and I'd love to field any questions you have.
All right, can I get a motion and a second to approve the work scope? Then I'll open up to questions to Stephen.
Leonard Diggins.
Go ahead, Leonard.
I can't think of anyone better to do equity analysis, so I am happy to approve. Just make the motion to approve this.
Eric Barassa.
Eric, go ahead.
Yes, I second this motion.
All right, any questions anyone has for Stephen? Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, so could you explain, I know a part of the analysis that we typically do when we're looking at changes to MBTA service is trying to understand are the changes, are they like treating everyone, equitably? So if the T cuts service, are we cutting it equitably? Are we only cutting it in certain neighborhoods? That kind of thing. Is that similar here? So like if the changes are made, they're not just, changes in one neighborhood or one community, but it's sort of like an equitable change across the region. Is that kind of how it's done?
That's generally how it's done. We kind of try to identify. We use the MBTA's DIDB policy, which is essentially the policy document that describes what you're supposed to do, and we're supposed to measure whether revenue vehicle hours attributed to each route or each service the MBTA provides change in a fair way, and we use either census data or, if we can, survey data to do this. And in the case of this project, because the changes are going to be, in theory, it's almost like a blue sky kind of exercise where we may need to move to a location-based data service instead. So there may be some figuring out exactly what is your population in there. That'll be interesting and new. And but yeah, the general idea is that we want to make sure that at the end of the day, negative impacts are borne by the different populations relatively fairly, and positive impacts go to groups relatively fairly as well.
Okay, and then my final question is, when do you think you will be doing this work? Because I know there's a lot of sort of movement still on what the bus network redesign is.
Yep. So I believe this, I don't remember the schedule exactly, but I believe it's through the fall is when we'll kind of start getting those first, it was something like the first 3 kind of broad packages of changes that might come out. And then from there, a public process and a preferred alternative would come out. So it's somewhere in that time frame. And I could find you more detail if I were to look at my notes, but I don't have that specifically in front of me.
Thank you.
And I should also say I'm working with Caroline Vaness in this. So if there's questions I don't know, I'll be forwarding them on to her for help answering those.
All right. Any other questions from anyone else?
Ryan Kane.
Ryan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Stephen. How are you? So correct me if I'm wrong. Does the T have to do an equity analysis no matter what, because it's presuming this is going to be a major change? Or is this just, we're just trying to get ahead of stuff and do the equity analysis anyway, figuring it will be a major change?
So I think it's more, we expect this to be a major change. If it weren't a major change, let's say it's there's a specific threshold that the T has to hit to actually have to do an analysis.
Yep.
And I think it's kind of 2 fronts where when you're doing this kind of system-wide reshuffling exercise, I think you want to know, even if it doesn't hit that have to threshold, like it's awfully good to know anyways.
That's fair.
And I think another part of it is like just the nature of the changes should be enough to create one. The addition of a single new route or the removal of a single old route by definition is enough to change the system, to trigger a major service change. And as soon as one route goes away, the policy is set up that you do everything. So as soon as any specific route hits a change,
okay,
you do everything. So
that makes sense.
It would take some crafty service changes to kind of avoid a major service change, and I think at that point, like, it'd be questionable how, like, what's going on. So I think it's kind of like, this is almost by its nature going to cause one. So it's let's look at it now. Let's look at the major alternatives, see if they're all kind of similar in equity, and then by the end, it's almost guaranteed that it's going to be the policy will be triggered. So start planning now rather than rushing at the end.
That makes sense, Stephen. Thank you. And I guess my second question would be, you mentioned incorporating additional data from MassDOT. Can you just talk a little bit about that? And will that data then sort of live in the model and be available for future analyses?
So the data I'm talking about there, to do a lot of these analyses now, we need something called the GTFS file, or the General Transit Feed Specification file, which is essentially just the schedule in this computer readable format.
Yep.
And a lot of times those schedules, that GTFS file doesn't get built until planners are actively, the schedule has been built and the T's planning scheduling software it's been built. We're like weeks away from service starting. And that's just too late to actually do a good service equity analysis on. And you kind of need to approve the changes before you get that scheduling process started. So that's too late in the process to really do anything with. So now the T is working on creating a kind of humorously named generalized General Transit Feed Specification file. So it's kind of a early GTFS file. They could come with kind of, it's kind of like the for planning purposes only on maps. It's like kind of for planning purposes GTFS file, and they can start building that early in the process. And we've incorporated that into our process before, but it's kind of like anytime we get a new one, there's a little bit of growing pain and making sure that like formats have really stayed the same and figuring out what to do with that. And then the other two metrics, there are also two metrics the T is working on, and I think they're still in a little bit of flux. We'll also need to just figure out how best to represent the equity of that, or if they give us the data and it's just like ready to go for equity work. And from how I understand it, it should fall into that. They're going to give us a set of 4 numbers, and hopefully we're just dividing the numbers and checking. And like, that's what I hope. I think how it was designed, it was designed from the start to be able to include these equity questions. So again, my hope is that it's a light lift on the new things.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions?
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Stephen, you know that I trust your work and I'm confident in your conclusions, but you also know that I've been wanting to get under the hood of this analysis for a number of years. And so my request is that when the study is done, especially since MBT is a client, and they're a member of this board, if you could maybe come back to us for a detailed explanation of your conclusions and how you got to them. And if not to this board, then maybe to RTAC. That's it. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thanks. We'll try that. And a lot of what we're trying to do a lot more with these DIDB analyses is we're trying to make as much of it accessible to the public. If it was like, hey, we want to give this entire thing out to the public, we're working on getting that more from the start, where it's the data sources are public, the process is public. So we're trying to get to a place where we're a little more able to share that and share the process, and instead of just like a trust us, it's trust us, and here's, if you don't, here's our work. So that's the place where we're always working a little bit towards that with each project we do, at least in our group, and I think across the agency. So hopefully that gets easier and easier over time.
All right. Anyone else?
David Kozes.
David, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Do we know where we'd be able to access the broader study? Who will be doing the rest of the work, in addition to this piece that we're talking about here? How many public meetings are scheduled? What's the timeline? Who approves the final, route changes? I just think it's really important that we sort of be kept informed with this particular project. Thank you.
Yep, I see that Rasheen sent a link to the MBTA's project page in the chat. Thank you for that. Another person who's Caroline Vaness at MassDOT is really critical in moving this project through. So if you want to be kept in the loop other than seeing like what's on the website, and you want to really connect with that project manager, I would talk to Caroline, and if you need help getting that connection made, I'd be happy to do that for you.
So David, Caroline works for planning, works for David and I. So, you can reach out to Steve and you can reach out to Ben and we can connect you with Caroline. Either way.
Okay, good. Thank you, guys.
All right. Anyone else?
Eric Barassa.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, so David Kosas, just responding to you. So at MAPC, we've been having a lot of great conversations with Carolyn Vaness and the folks at the T working on this. And we want to offer to try to help connect municipalities into this process and host forums and other ways that both municipal planning staff and even mayors and other municipal leaders can kind of tap into this process. So I think there's a meeting coming up shortly to talk more about some of the things we can do. We definitely want to have the team come to the intercore, committee to talk about it. We're actively involved in working with Carolyn and the team at the T on figuring out, how the public in general, but particularly municipalities can plug into this process. It's at the very, very beginning, David.
All right. Anyone else?
Tom Bent.
Go ahead, Tom.
Just quickly, actually, thank you, Eric, for what you just said, because I was going to ask about that. So that would be great if we could work through you, through the intercore committee to discuss all this. So thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
Seeing none.
All right. Jonathan, you want to read the roll?
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes, Kansas.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Stephen. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 11. It's the federal fiscal year 2022 to 2026 TIP transit element for the MBTA. Jillian, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. All right, I'm just gonna go.
I can hear you, Jillian. So
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. Again, I think at this point, everyone knows who I am, but my name is Jillian. I'm the Director of Capital Planning at the MBTA. I was here about a month ago and gave a presentation and an update on the MBTA's capital investment plan, including a recap of the current TIP. I'm here today to provide just a quick update on a couple of things with the CIP that have evolved, and to present an introduction to the MBTA's fiscal year 21 TIP amendment and the fiscal year 22 to 26 TIP. Next slide, please. Again, this is a familiar slide. This is just a quick recap of the overall CIP development process. As a reminder, in April, we're continuing to refine our project sequencing and the draft project list. The big focus of the month is typically drafting the 5-year TIP, which I am here today to present. In May, MassDOT and the MBTA will formally present the draft CIP to the joint board and will vote to release the draft for public comment. And then as always, in June, we review the outcomes of the public engagement process and present the final CIP to the joint board for review and vote. Just a quick note about the CIP. At the April 12th FMCB meeting, I did provide a preview of the MBTA's draft CIP. So if anyone is interested, that presentation is available on the MBTA website. That will cover a bit more detail about the overall CIP, whereas today's presentation will focus just on the tip more closely. Next slide, please. So to begin, as a quick update, we've made one adjustment to the source assumptions that were previously presented. Under the federal program section, you'll now note that we are no longer planning to transfer any funds to support the operating budget. Instead, all federal formula funds are expected to be restored to the capital plan. Next slide, please. So this slide goes into a bit more detail. With the receipt of the CRISA funds and the pending receipt of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or ARPA funds, the MBTA has been able to return all preventative maintenance funds to the capital program. As a result, the remaining 281 in preventative maintenance funds will now come back to the capital program as funds that are available to program from previous fiscal years. So for the fiscal year 22 CIP, our updated source assumptions reflect roughly 1.9 billion in fiscal year 22 sources, which is in addition to almost 1.8 billion in funds from previous years. And just as a reminder, the funds from previous years reflect the estimated balance of funds authorized and available but unexpended as of July 1st, 2021. And these funds are programmed to existing projects with spend anticipated and planned in fiscal year 22 and beyond. Next slide, please. So taking a look at the fiscal year 22 to 26 federal funding sources, we've now updated these numbers to reflect the return of the preventative maintenance funds. So looking at the 5-year TIP window, as opposed to the 1-year CIP window, there is about 2 billion in FTA formula funds available to program in the TIP, with both the Section 5307 and 5337 funds now increasing since my last presentation. And then the balance of the federal funds, as shown in the bar chart, reflect executed FTA grants as well as other federal programs like GLX and FRA grants. And as always, just the reminder that the federal program is a subset of the larger MBTA capital program, and the projects that are put onto the TIP are determined after we go through the larger CIP prioritization process. Next slide, please. Just quickly before leaving the topic of funding and sources, I did want to quickly address the potential future federal funds because I know this came up at the last meeting. As we know, on March 11th, President Biden signed the ARPA, or American Rescue Plan Act, into law, which included $30.5 billion in federal funding to support public transportation. As it has been presented, the Boston UZA is expected to receive $907 million in additional operating assistance. There was also $1.675 billion allocated towards capital investment grants, which includes $103.5 million for the Green Line extension. The MBTA is still awaiting and working with our federal partners on the specific details of the eligible uses for the support provided, and therefore we have not yet updated any of these source assumptions to reflect those changes. Regarding future additional federal investments, we continue to actively prepare for any new sources and expect to utilize our existing annual capital investment planning process, our CIP, to inform any new capital funding that may come up. So just as, yeah. Anyway, next slide, please. So shifting gears to talk about the TIP, as a quick just reminder, if someone wasn't here for the last presentation, the MBTA CIP is aligned with the priorities and program structure developed by the MassDOT CIP. We have 18 MBTA programs that we use to help develop our CIP. These programs are slightly different than what is included in the TIP. Next slide, please. As everyone should be familiar, our TIP is broken out into these following TIP programs with the listed federal funding program sources. So at this time today, the MBTA is presenting an amendment to our federal fiscal year 21 to 25 TIP, which will become Amendment 6. And we are presenting our proposed draft federal fiscal year 22 to 26 TIP. Both of these items are being presented to the MPO for their vote at the May 6th meeting, but today we're just quickly reviewing them. Also, the TIP tables are also available on the website. So I definitely encourage you to go check those out. My presentation today is just intended to be a high-level look and preview as to what you will see in those tables, but in advance of the vote, we would encourage everyone to look at those details more closely. So looking at notable changes, these updated TIP documents will reflect the obligation of $150 million in Section 5309 funding for GLX, along with $41.2 million of FRA funding for Tower 1. We are also now including $1 million to reflect an award of a CARSI grant for North Wilmington Station. And then we'll cover this in more detail on the next 2 slides, but there are 5 new projects funded with FTA formula funds on the TIP and 6 projects that we are exploring the use of federal RIF or TIFIA loans for. The remaining TIP projects that are included on the TIP are consistent with what has previously been included, and which I largely covered during my last presentation, so I wasn't going to go into those details today. But I've also, in the appendix of this presentation, included the TIP tables, which include project descriptions for your reference. Next slide, please. So with the FTA formula funds that are available to program in the TIP, the MBTA anticipates that federal funds will be programmed to the following new projects. The first new project on the TIP is the Quincy Bus Facility Modernization Program. This project was included on the fiscal year 21 CIP for early design and real estate. In the preview of the fiscal year 22 CIP that we have presented, we are planning to have additional funds programmed to support the full design and construction of the new Quincy Bus Facility. And along with that, we are adding this project to the TIP as we plan to use federal funds to support the project. Second project is the replacement of the East Street Bridge in Dedham, which is a bridge that carries the Franklin Line commuter rail service and CSX freight service. Again, this was previously included on the MBTA CIP, but with different sources and is now being moved over to federal sources. There's also a new project to support a small amount of additional scope to replace track circuits in order to improve reliability and performance as part of the Green Line Central Tunnel project. This is an existing project in the CIP, but also one that we are planning to allocate additional funds, a small amount of additional funds to in the 22 CIP update. We are also adding to the TIP phase 3 of the MBTA's asset management program. Earlier phases of this work have been included on previous TIPs, and this is just a continuation of that overall program and our practice of federalizing this work. And then finally, we have the Attleboro Station Improvements Project. This is actually a project that the MBTA is working on with GATRA to make some state of good repair and accessibility improvements to this commuter rail station. These will actually be GATRA funds that will be transferred to the MBTA to support this work. Next slide, please. The MBTA is also currently exploring the use of federal loans through the Build America Bureau to finance certain capital projects. There are 2 programs, the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program, or RIF, and the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or the TIFIA program. In order to be eligible for these programs, projects must be included in the State Transportation Improvement Program. So while the MBTA continues to explore this financing opportunity, we are including these projects kind of below the line in the TIP. You'll see them on the TIP table, so I just wanted to acknowledge that here today. These projects are currently included on the MBTA CIP. However, many of them are not yet fully funded through construction. But as I should note, any additional project and funding information on this topic will be provided through a future TIP amendment if federal funds or loans are utilized. This is effectively just trying to maximize our flexibility as we continue to seek additional sources. Next slide, please. So finally, just to recap some next steps for the development of the CIP and the TIP. As I mentioned, May 6th is when the MPO is scheduled to vote to release the draft TIP for public comment. The MBTA will then consider any public comments received prior to the final TIP approval. On the CIP side, the MBTA and MassDOT are scheduled to present the draft 22 CIP at the joint meeting of the MassDOT board and the FMCB on May 24th. The document will then be released for public comment, revised as necessary, and voted on for final approval on June 21st. And then I do want to just highlight the planned public engagement schedule for the 22 CIP. If you could jump to the next slide. Looking ahead to the release of the draft CIP in May, MassDOT in collaboration with the MBTA will manage a public engagement strategy similar to previous years. This includes engagement with key stakeholders, collecting input from the general public, and then analyzing the feedback and responding to comments. There are currently 6 public meetings scheduled, which will all be held virtually. We will also be collecting feedback through the CIP comment tool, emails, and letters. The meeting details and links will be posted on the MassDOT website shortly. So I just wanted to get this information out there for anyone who is interested. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. I'm happy to address any questions.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Jillian?
Brian Kane.
Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this an action item? I guess is the question. I was going to move it, but if it's not, no. Okay. I just wanted to thank Jillian. She appeared before the advisory board at a meeting yesterday. We had 40 communities present where this was also presented. She took several questions, and I just wanted to express my gratitude. The advisory board is going to go through a rigorous examination of the CIP through its capital committee. We plan to spend the next sort of 30 days doing that, and we will come back with very detailed comments at a later date. But I just wanted to thank Jillian and suggest that while it is perhaps not ideal that this is a one-year CIP, the cash flows certainly do go out 5 years, and that is meeting the requirements of the rules. I think we all wish this was a 5-year document, a 5-year plan, on paper. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it certainly seems like it is a 5-year plan in terms of the cash flows. So thank you, Jillian, and to everyone on your team for all the work.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Other questions for Jillian?
Seeing none.
All right. Thank you, Jillian.
Thanks.
All right. We'll move on to the next agenda item, Matt, which I believe is agenda item 12, exploring resiliency MPO funded corridor intersection studies. Seth, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Seth Asante, MPO staff. The goal of today's presentation is to share with you the results of the MPO study exploring resilience in corridor and intersection studies. Incorporating resilience into transportation system infrastructure is a statewide priority, and it's a growing challenge, and addressing the issue is very important. Next slide, please. The objectives of the studies were to increase MPO staff knowledge with resiliency planning for transportation infrastructure. Also to enable MPO staff to incorporate resilience into corridor and intersection studies, and to provide technical assistance to communities seeking to address climate change challenges. Next slide. These are the tasks included in the study. MPO staff researched work in Massachusetts on climate change resiliency. We also identified data sources and models for vulnerability and adaptation assessment. We surveyed MPO municipalities to understand how they are incorporating resilience practices into their planning and engineering projects. We also selected Route 1A in the city of Revere for a pilot study to incorporate resiliency. And we came out with recommended ways to incorporate resiliency into MPO funded studies. Next slide, please. Next slide. There are several resiliency activities going on statewide. The State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan has outlined the specific actions and strategies to manage risk of climate change and natural hazards. The Resilient Massachusetts Action Team has also been established to implement the objectives of the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. The team is currently developing guidelines with best practices for state agencies to implement climate resilient standard. Also, at the municipal level, there is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which provides funding for communities to develop action-oriented plans, conduct vulnerability assessments, and implement priority projects. And the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, which represent municipalities' commitment to address potential hazards and allocate resources to mitigation activities. Next slide, please. These are several activities that is going on at the Boston Region MPO. In the current long-range transportation plan, Destination 2040, the MPO strengthened its vision and goals for a resilient transportation system. The MPO has also revised its project selection criteria for the long-range transportation plan and the transportation improvement program to include resilience, and is currently exploring ways to incorporate climate resiliency into corridor and intersection studies. Next slide, please. As part of the study, MPO staff conducted a survey of municipalities in the Boston Region MPO to learn more about resilient practices. These are the communities that responded to the survey. They are shown in the brown color. 19 communities within the Boston Region MPO responded. According to the survey, roads, bridges, culverts, pedestrian and bicycle facilities, public transportation are the major transportation assets vulnerable to climate hazards. Next slide. These are some of the tools that the communities use to address climate change impacts on transportation. The most popular tools are the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the Hazard Mitigation Plans, and the Capital Improvement Program. Next slide. These are the types of assistance that the responded that is needed. Majority of the responded indicated that guidance on updating design standards to make transportation assets more resilient is needed. Also, technical assistance and resources to municipalities to address climate change impacts. Promoting and sharing of best practices, and also convening regional discussions on climate change issues. Next slide. Staff selected Route 1A in the city of Revere for a pilot study to incorporate resiliency. We selected Route 1A because it's vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal storms, and tidal floods. The primary objectives of the pilot study was to work with MassDOT and the city of Revere to identify the vulnerabilities and also to develop recommendations to make Route 1A resilient. Next slide. These photos of Route 1A at the point of Pine neighborhood shows where Route 1A is most vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal storms, and tidal floods. There have been cases of flooding in the past that have led to closing Route 1 for several days. Next slide, please. The vulnerabilities of Route 1A were assessed based on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. The assessment included evaluating flood probabilities and depth of flooding for 4 scenarios. These scenarios include the present day, 2030, 2050, and 2070. Next slide. These risk maps show the 1% flood risk probability for the present day. Next slide, please. Okay. Also, the next map, which shows 2070 flood risk probability. And you can see the changes from present day to 2070. And as you can see, Route 1A, which is here, is completely underwater in 2070. By 2070, there is a high probability that Route 1A will be overtopped at high tide. The blue colors indicate the areas where Route 1A is overtopped at high tide, and where Route 1A is also have the high probability of being flooded. The white areas are the dry areas, and the pink areas are areas that have less than 1% chance of flooding. Next slide. We came out with several solutions for making Route 1A resilient. Nature-based solution is one of them. They are very effective and low-cost solution that blends in with the natural environment. The city of Revere is currently has restored 6.6 acres of salt water marsh in the study area and is working on restoring an additional 7.3 acres of salt marsh. Restoring the salt marshes in the area that have been invaded by invasive species would help prevent and control flooding. Next slide. Another option for the corridor is the Saugus River Floodgate Strategy. This is a regional collaboration effort to address climate change and rising sea level by providing high-level coastal protection for 5 communities, which includes Everett, Lynn, Malden, Revere, and Saugus. The project consists of a floodgate on the mouth of the Saugus River and 3.1 miles of shorefront improvements. This project will protect several assets as indicated on the slide and the region from flooding, and it also includes Route 1A. Next slide, please. MPO staff also recommend as an assessment of the capacities of the culverts, stormwater pumps, tide gates to determine the necessary short-term repairs and their long-term replacement. Past inspection indicate that some of the culverts are undersized. Also, the design data behind these culverts are outdated and that the access may not be adequate to handle projected storms and extreme precipitation in the future. Next slide. The final option is elevating roadway in low-lying areas. In certain areas, Route 1A is just under 10 feet above sea level. And elevating the roadway will ensure that Route 1A can continue to provide the vital services in the future. Next slide. This study has provided MPO staff with several opportunities, knowledge, experience, and experience in transportation resiliency. Ample resources, data, model, tools currently exist to help MPO staff to conduct and incorporate resiliency into our studies. The Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model is available, and inland flooding tools are currently being developed. The RMAT team is also developing guidelines with best practices for state agencies to implement climate resilient standards. MPO staff could use these tools to incorporate resiliency into our studies. Next slide. Also, we have compiled all the action plans and priority projects from the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program and the hazard mitigation plans. MPO staff can coordinate our studies with the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program and the hazard mitigation plan to use existing resources effectively. In addition, MPO staff continued participation in regional collaboration efforts on resiliency will help improve regional transportation resiliency. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Seth. Questions for Seth?
Leonard Diggins.
Go ahead, Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And mostly comments. So first, I thought the content of the responses to the survey were really very, very interesting. And I think they pointed to a good role for the MPO in the staff in supporting communities and making the transportation system more resilient. And we have it's a big focus of the LRTP. And I think this is a great pilot study. With respect to the responses, the response rate, 20%, it may be poor for the course, it may be good by some level of measurement, but I think it's really, really poor. And we've got to do something about that. And rather than putting the onus on the staff, I think I'm going to put the onus on the advisory council, because we've done a poor job at increasing our membership too. And I think we need to work on doing some more outreach to let people know about the advisory council. And in doing so, hopefully we can provide you with another way of getting to the municipalities. And when you have a survey out there, you can hopefully use us to get people to respond to these surveys. So thank you for the great work. This is really good work. And I only managed to read the executive summary, but I'm looking forward to reading the rest and inviting you to talk to the advisory council. So once again, thank you.
All right, a question.
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. I think that's right. we sent several reminders on the survey, and we're also a little bit concerned about the response rate. I think one of the issues that I was thinking about is that maybe some communities are beginning to put their resiliency plans together, and they didn't have enough information maybe to participate in the survey. But going forward, I think it will be we will get useful information if all the communities participate in the survey, so we can know how resiliency activities are going on within the MPO region.
Okay. Others for Seth?
We have a comment from Roisin.
All right, go ahead, Roisin.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick just to talk about the survey. I think one aspect of this that was really tough is that when we were doing the survey, it was last summer, and it was, a lot of municipalities were really focused on dealing with pandemic response. And I think that there was just a ton going on. We had a lot of trouble with all of our outreach in that time period, just because there were so many demands on municipal staff. So I think that was part of it. And then also I just wanted to highlight that we have sort of through this process and through the MAPC sub-regional process really strengthened a lot of our relationships, particularly with the South Shore since the survey went out. And so I think that in the future, we've sort of laid a lot of groundwork that can hopefully get us some better response rates in the future. But yeah, it's definitely something we're paying attention to and thinking about as we go forward.
Others with comments or questions?
Eric Barassa.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, so this topic is something we've heard increasingly from our cities and towns, interested in understanding, how to incorporate climate resiliency into the transportation planning, understanding more about climate resilient, infrastructure, and I wonder, and maybe this is something we can talk more about, Seth and Roisin offline. I wonder if there's like an opportunity to coordinate and maybe even try to do another push to get some more survey responses out there, because I do think hearing more from cities and towns about kind of specifically like what they see as like their kind of needs and level of interest would be great. So we're happy to try to help do that again, and we can talk more offline about that. But thank you for this work.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else?
L. Baker.
Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to Seth and his team. They've been excellent to work with. L. Baker from the City of Riviera and the Planning and Development Department. And it was an excellent partnership throughout the process with Mass DOT. And it's a real compliment to a lot of the other resiliency work that we're doing in the city. And it really, took us in the direction of a hard focus on the planning that's necessary to get us where we need to be to protect our infrastructure and our residents. So really, I just want to say thank you to Seth and his team and to all of you for moving this project and this study forward.
All right, thank you for that comment, Al. Anyone else?
Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Thank you, Seth, for the report. I just wanted to echo Leonard's sentiments. The one thing that stood out to me too was also the survey, or the lack, particularly on the South Shore survey responses. So I would encourage, if there is an opportunity to, reissue the survey, or at a minimum to lean on the coalition to outreach to those communities. I know there's been a tremendous amount of work done around resiliency in many, if not all, of the South Shore communities. And I think we definitely need their input. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right, anyone else?
Seeing none.
All right, let's move. I know we're getting short on time, so let's get to our agenda item 13, which is the modeling roadmap by Marty. Go ahead, Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Matt, will you drive the slides for me?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for hanging on for this presentation. And as Tegan mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a follow-on from when I spoke with the board last year about exploratory modeling and some of the new practices we are adopting around that. But as I also mentioned, we're going to start with a look at the fundamentals. But before I dive into the presentation, I want to take a moment and acknowledge what you might have heard about the model, the CTPS model. So this is often referring to our latest implementation of a regional travel demand model. And so this is often cited and it's actively used in much of our work. And I would characterize the way that model is applied is as a predictive tool. What that means is we're using that tool, that model, to generate estimates of important metrics on transit and roadway conditions and travel, given a specific set of inputs and assumptions. So that work is absolutely essential and necessary and is continuing. But if we think about the uncertainty that we are facing, that we're living through and facing in the short and long term, we have to acknowledge that the usefulness of just a single point prediction is limited. Considering the range of potential futures, did we pick the most useful point to give us those insights and help us support our decision? Do we happen to fall in the best case scenario or the worst case scenario or something that's maybe somewhere in between? So with that as motivation, what we really want to do is drive a reframe on how we incorporate models, models plural, into the planning process. So this involves how do we, from the beginning, design them, implement them, and run them? How do we specify and analyze the scenarios that we'll use these tools to run against? And also how we think about the model itself, or models. Because the risk of that single point prediction is that it can actually seem as an assertion of this is what the future will be, rather than a representation of our assumptions about what might happen. So, so as I mentioned, we're gonna start like breaking down on the fundamentals, and I really want to get models down to their essence, and then as we build that back up and start talking about the futures, I hope it's a space where everyone, even non-modeler, self-identifying non-modelers, can be part of that conversation. So starting with the fundamentals, this is not going to be a very technical presentation, and we will have opportunities to speak more technically about the model. But I think the fundamentals will ring true even for the self-identified modelers out there on the call. So we can go ahead to the first slide of the fundamentals. And so our most basic question, what does it mean to say you're modeling? What does it mean to model? Well, a model is a decision support tool. And so what we do in modeling is we pick out the relevant items to that decision and kind of assume or assert how they're related, and then use that representation or simplification of the process to give us some information about the decision. So if you can answer the question, why did you make that decision? You've used a model. Now, if the answer to the why is just because I always do, then you're using more of a heuristic approach or a rule, just a simple rule-based decision. So as an example, I'm going to use the decision, one of the few decisions that we have to make each day, which is what do you make for dinner? If you have a rule-based approach, maybe it's Tuesday, it's Taco Tuesdays. More of a modeling-based approach might be look in the fridge, what ingredients do you have? Think about what you made last night, the night before, how much time do you have to cook? How hungry are you? Now, in neither situation, what we do is make all of the meals that we could possibly make, eat them, and then say, okay, well, which one took the least amount of time and made us feel, the most satisfied? That's obviously not a feasible approach. And that's a direct analogy to why we need models to support our decisions around transportation projects and policies. So the other really useful thing about models is that we can explain decisions and then insights to other stakeholders. So when my spouse asks me, what are we having for dinner? I can use the model to explain, this is why we're having tacos. It's the only ingredients in the fridge are taco shells and fillings, rather than just saying the model said tacos and that's what it's going to be. Now, the other interesting thing is with that information, my spouse might say, I don't want tacos tonight. I don't care. It's the only thing to eat. So we might then make a totally different decision, which is let's order takeout. So in this case, the model didn't tell us what to do. It couldn't have told us order takeout, you don't like tacos. But based on the model's information, we were able to make a better decision. And so I really want to start with this very basic fundamental discussion of models, because I often hear from people, even analytical people, that they're not modelers. And so they're like, oh, you modelers, I can't understand what you do. And I purposely didn't wear my hooded cloak to this meeting to seem more accessible. I had some incense burning, but I assume you can't quite smell that. But I really want to make the point that we are all modelers. We all use models in our own way to help us make decisions. And you don't need to understand the programming, the math, and the mechanics of the model in order to actually get the important information out of how that result came about, just like the situation of my spouse and the tacos. So I think at this point now we can take a look at the different parts of a model. We can go to the next slide, Matt. And so I've organized it. There are two essential main components to the model: the inputs and the theories or assumptions. So the inputs, this is what we often call scenarios. For the food example or dinner example, it was ingredients, time, recent meals. For transportation, it's land use, networks, that sort of thing. Now, the theory and assumptions is just different from the inputs because this is essentially how we are asserting or assuming that the inputs are related to each other. So with the food, it's, well, given the set of ingredients, how long will it take me to make that particular meal? For transportation, it's given this orientation of where people live, where they work, what the transportation networks are like in between, what will their travel behavior be? And so we take those two parts and we need to realize them on what I'm calling here a model platform. So depending on the extent and the complexity of the inputs and assumptions, the model platform could just be in your head, just a mental model. Or the complexity of the inputs and assumptions might be so great that you need purpose-built software to represent it, which is exactly the case in representing things like a regional roadway network or a transit network. So with this platform, you can then interact the inputs based on the assumptions and produce some results. I want to emphasize that everything you see on the screen, these are the parts of the model. So the results cannot be any more specific or include any more information than what is provided by the inputs or assumptions. So if the input to your model is simply more transit service, the result of that model couldn't be, here is the estimated change in riders on the 77 at Porter Square, unless you had some assumptions that could translate from more transit as an input into a very specific transit service plan. But I also want to say, just because the model can't do it doesn't mean it can't be useful in developing those more specific inputs. So to go back to the dinner example, when I'm out food shopping, I could perhaps use my model to decide what ingredients to pick up, knowing that will give me a range of different things to make. So I'm going to say these are all the necessary parts of a model, but not sufficient. There's an essential piece missing, and that goes to the next slide. We'll see the essential piece is you. Sorry for the corniness, but I want you to recall the whole purpose of modeling is to support decisions. Therefore, without a stakeholder, without that decision maker, the model doesn't have any purpose besides, maybe it's a toy, but it's not a tool. And our goal is to build tools. So in order to realize that goal, the stakeholder has to have a very active role in the modeling process. They need to communicate, they need to input their needs to the model, and these needs then shape the inputs, assumptions, and results. And then the stakeholder, the other side of it is that they understand they're not getting the answers out of the model. Rather, they're receiving what we're calling here insights between those defined inputs and assumptions. So I hope you all take on this responsibility of being a good stakeholder, and I have some guiding questions on the next slide to help you think through it. Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. So number one question when considering using a modeling tool to help your decision is, will it help you make a better decision? The question is not, will this model predict the future accurately? I mean, I think the situation we're all in right now, we know that couldn't be the case for many situations. So the next question is, can I describe my problem, the decision I need to make, in what I'm calling here modelable terms? So what are the parts of a model? Number one, inputs. Can you actually represent, the important part of what will feed into your decision in some simplified inputs? Do you have a theory or assumptions on how those inputs are related? Do you have a platform? I mean, is this something simple enough to keep in your head, or is there so much complexity of the inputs and assumptions that you really need some kind of purpose-built software? And then finally, I want to give the example of a of a decision that is not necessarily modelable. And that's the two roads diverging in a yellow wood. So it's not a model decision because, as Frost explains in the poem, there is no difference between these two roads. Although maybe after the fact you can come up with one, but unless you have that at the beginning, really doesn't feed into your model. So this next question, can I use it? And what I want to highlight here is there are real constraints to using modeling tools. And the more complex the tool, the more constraints. Data is one of the biggest ones, especially for our transportation models. Also, developing the data, validating the data, developing the software, and again, testing and validating the software, and also the time to actually specify it and run it and analyze it. And the other question about usability that I want you to keep in mind is, can you use the results and explain that to your other stakeholders? So can you actually get people to see how the inputs and assumptions are defined and related such that they can use these outputs to make a better decision? And then finally, always need to ask the question, does it make sense? So we don't ask the question, does it capture every detail in the real world? That answer is no, of course not. It's a model, that's the whole point. But what it does capture are those inputs and assumptions reasonable based on the decision I want to make. When I think about it, models really help us tell the story, but they're not the sole author, right? They have the simplified view and they need us to then take that and put it into the broader context. So I'll try to use my dinner example one more time. And it's thinking about the last time I made tacos, the avocado's a little gone off, we didn't feel very good afterwards. So even though when the model results come up and say, hey, it's taco night again, we may pass on that. But the goal is not to make the model represent every individual aspect. We have to make that decision. So now to talk about modeling at CTPS in the next slide. And why we model. Well, the number one reason is that we need to produce estimates to fulfill required processes, including our long-range transportation plan. But beyond that, models can be very powerful communication tools. At the MPO, we have a variety of stakeholders with different interests, priorities, and expectations. A model can be a platform for those needs to be communicated amongst the stakeholders and provide that consistent platform for evaluation of different projects and policies. The model results can be very useful to communicate insights to that complex set, and this is where I'm including a graphic here based on model outputs. And so what this graphic is showing is the volume of traffic that's using Day Boulevard northbound. So Day is that little kind of crescent shaped on the upper right. So the width of the line is showing us how much volume is going through there in the AM period. So just looking at this graphic, we can get a lot of information. We can see where's the traffic coming from. So we see a lot of it's coming up Morrissey, some on 93, and more or less the rest coming over from Columbia. But also where it's going and how it's kind of winding its way through the seaport, and even seeing that some of it's going up to the Ted Williams. So I hope this impresses upon you how complex a transportation network can be, and how we couldn't possibly hold that in our heads. Right? If we ask a bunch of people, where do you think Day Boulevard traffic is going? They'll all have their different idea based on where they go, how they use it. But with this very relatively simple representation, we can communicate a much more complete picture. So that kind of getting people out of their heads, that's speaking to this last point about helping people avoid the fallacies in our thinking. And this is just a natural thing on how we approach the world. We overfocus on certain factors that are important to us based on our experience. We have some anecdotal evidence about what we do in certain situations, and then we would apply that for the full, to the full decision. So if we can just get that out of our heads and put it in a format where other people can assess it and make their own determination, or even just put it into context, that's when it can be much more useful, what's coming out of that process. So with that, I hope this background of the fundamentals can help people feel a little more comfortable talking about modeling, and then help us start thinking towards the futures. So we'll move on to the future section now. So I'm going to start just by listing out some of the trends that we're seeing in generally the state of the practice. So the number one trend, you probably won't be surprised to hear, is moving away from modeling approaches that focus on accuracy and trying to represent a lot of detail into things that are better suited to handle uncertainty and what we're calling deep uncertainty in what the inputs and assumptions might be. We could give it one more click there, Matt. Go to the next trend. So when we think about accuracy, the other side of that is usually complexity, a lot of things in the model. And that's okay if you're really focusing on a narrow set, a small number of items. But if you want to cover a broader range of inputs, a range of scenarios, a more usable model, meaning easier to set up, easier to understand, easier to get the outputs out of, is more important. One more click, Matt. So then finally, the trend that we wanted to mention is the move from this unified model that represents it all into more kind of right-sized suite of tools. So I mean, that sounds great, right? Suite of tools, more flexible, dynamic, specific, but there is a downside to it. And the downside is, because it's not a unified platform, each tool A might produce a certain estimate of VMT with a given scenario, and model B might produce a different estimate. Which one is right? Well, they're models. These are estimates. So if we're focusing on a prediction of the future, we say, well, there's only one future possible. But if instead we're looking to gain insights, then it's actually okay or even preferable to get different responses, because then we get a slightly different perspective on our inputs and assumptions. So we can move on, and I want to. So this is what we've set out as our long-term goal for modeling at CTPS. This is a wordy slide, apologize for that. So I'll just give it a read with some dramatic effect. So our goal is that we have a reliable and robust, meaning useful across many different situations and scenarios, a set of well-documented, so it's transparent and accessible, travel demand tools, data, and procedures. All three of those are necessary. And that these address our diverse set of needs for transportation planning in the Boston region and statewide. And then, of course, the other key component is our engaged and informed stakeholders. And to supporting that, we need to emphasize the staff, and that our team of modelers have the skills, they have the knowledge and the experience to maintain these tools, data, procedures, develop new ones as we get new challenges, new questions to answer, apply them appropriately, and of course, communicate all things related to that. And when I say all things, the strengths, usability, value, but also the limitations. So our stakeholders understand how to use those results in context. So then I did want to put some actual model results in this presentation. On the next slide. So this is an output of our regional travel demand model hooked up to FHWA's Travel Model Improvement Program Exploratory Modeling Analysis Tool, otherwise known as TMIP EMAT. And what this tool does is let us use essentially our regional travel demand model many, many times, rather than the about a day it takes to run each scenario. So I've presented two scatter plots here, and each point in the scatter plot is an individual scenario. So a unique set of inputs and assumptions, and then these are the results. So these are plotted by the inputs on the x-axis, on the horizon, and then on the vertical axis is the outputs. So even just, I've taken away the labels and just put these generic input A, input B. You don't see any numbers, but with these two scatter plots, I'd say you actually can get a lot of information. So I will give you some context to help you think through it. Let's say input A is work from home levels, and input B is vehicle automation. And then output X is, I'll just say, commuter rail ridership. So with that information, you say, well, which input has a larger impact on our commuter rail ridership? Is it work from home behavior or is it vehicle automation? Well, work from home behavior, you can see it's a much tighter plot. So any change in that, it leads to a stronger response in commuter rail ridership, where vehicle automation and input B, it's more of a spread. Now there is definitely a trend. You can see, this shifted square, but it's not as strong of a response. So I hope this helps you see that if I just gave you a single point, I picked a level of work from home behavior, a level of vehicle automation, and said, here's the commuter rail ridership, you wouldn't get a lot of those other insights, which is, given the uncertainty around both of those factors, I think is pretty important and what we want to communicate here. So with that, I just want to close out with some of our next steps on the final slide. So we are actively working on adapting our tools to support the next LRTP in 2023. And this is going to involve supporting an exploratory scenario planning process, producing results like what we just saw, as well as enhancing and taking to the next level our DIDB metrics. Another key part of this effort is communicating with stakeholders, why I'm here today. But we also have kind of an internal model steering committee, including Bob Fry from OTP and Tim Reardon from MAPC. And what I'd like to do, and what we're planning to do in the next month or so, is actually engage a broader set of stakeholders to do a review of our decision and our design decisions for the new model to date, and to talk about what are the important things for stakeholders. So part of my presentation now is calling for interested stakeholders to volunteer to participate in this review. It will involve an initial kind of discussion, review of the decisions and some travel demand modeling concepts, and then another session for more feedback and responding to questions. So we'll do that in the next, say, month or so points as we continue to develop the model. And we see this as a very two-way street. It's about as much about informing our stakeholders about the modeling practice and getting their needs and understanding that. So we plan to come back to this forum, at least following the stakeholder reviews, to share that feedback and summarize it, and then also as the development of the model converges. And with that, I hope we have some time for questions.
So thanks for that, Marty. We have about 5 minutes because I know we have a hard stop at 12:15. So can I see if anyone has some questions? If there's a lot of questions, we can always put this as a quick agenda item for next month, next week's meeting. But in terms of people that would like to be on the stakeholder engagement thing, let's save the time on that. Just let Marty know if you're interested. Let's not waste time on that part right now. So Eric, go ahead.
Marty, I want to thank you for a good presentation and for this work. I think this is fabulous. I would just point out, and maybe it's something you guys can think about in terms of like stakeholder engagement. I think one of the challenges that the public engages with the model is when we're looking at a project, a transportation project that's going through the environmental permitting process, where there's sort of like one alternative, like there's kind of like one future versus like a no build kind of like, and I think that's where people feel more frustrated, where there's not as much opportunity to look at like lots of different like future alternatives. So I think recognizing that tension is an important thing to explain to people, that sometimes this modeling, when it goes for environmental permitting processes, is has that tension, and I think we just need to be upfront about it, because I think that's where we get a lot of comments from the public with respect to the outputs of the modeling and what are being used as inputs and assumptions. So, but thank you.
All right, others that have questions for Marty.
Ken Miller.
Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Marty. Just to follow up on what Eric says, I mean, he raises a good point, but that a lot of the questions related to, and I'm not going to mention any particular projects, but I think I think we maybe know what we're thinking about, and that relates to, the output is related to the scenarios that you model, and to the extent that those scenarios reflect different ideas about what makes sense moving forward, then you're going to get different outputs, and I think that sometimes is lost, lost on the folks who were just looking at the outputs and comparing alternatives. But I did have a question, about one of your slides. You showed that, hey, one of the trends is moving, from complexity to usability. But those are not mutually exclusive, right? I mean, you have different. I understand there are resource issues, obviously, with maintaining very complex or a variety of tools. But to Eric's question, I mean, you still need to be able to do alternatives analysis and project level alternatives analysis and things that. So just as a question, I mean, moving forward, I mean, CTVS is still going to be maintaining complex travel demand model capability to be able to do alternatives analysis. You may be adding in other tools to be able to do quick turnaround kinds of things, or more policy level analysis, or things like that. Is that fair to say?
Marty?
There we go. Okay, I couldn't unmute myself there. Thank you, Ken. No, it's a great point. And when I'm speaking to complexity, I'm actually talking more about the kind of the state of the practice trend in travel demand modeling, especially what I observed as a consultant, which I was until about 1.5 years ago. And that was the development of more disaggregate representation of travel demand and interactions within the household and coordination of trips. And I would say that has peaked and is actually now focusing more on what are the responses that are most directly beneficial to the decision. So the complexity of our current state of the practice model, I would say, it certainly will be maintained. I don't mean to suggest we're going to be simplifying necessarily that aspect. Does that help give you the where my head is?
Yes, thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question. Is there anyone's hands raised, Matt?
Seeing none.
All right, thank you, Marty, for that. We'll move on to the next agenda item, for which is member items. Are there any items that members would like to bring to the board today? All right, seeing none. Matt, do you see anything?
Seeing none.
All right, can I get a motion and second to adjourn, please?
Eric Barassa,
Go ahead, Eric.
Motion to adjourn.
Len Diggins,
Second.
All right, all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstentions? All right, thank you, everyone. We got through a lot today. We will see you next week, and stay safe, please. Thank you.